look at the race and gender now, and white women earn a lot more than black men. Okay, so which binary am I going to go with? Which binary? Wait, what's going on there? Black men are half as likely as black women to go to college and get a college degree. The gender gap between black women and black men on almost every positive dimension is bigger than for other racial groups. And so actually what I think is that black men, and I argue—
Can you restate that? Because that's a really important point. That's a really important point.
Which one? It's the top one.
That the gender gap between black men and black women on almost anything you can name or care about is much bigger than the gender gap between white men and white women.
What? Correct. Yeah, you've just said it better than me, so that's great. Yes.
All right. Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope all are well, that things are going well for you. Got another one for you guys today, man. Somebody sent me an article dealing with black male homelessness in LA. And I have not lived in LA in quite a bit, but I always find it interesting to cover different elements of it. But I noticed something reading this article that took me back to some of the things I've been talking about this last couple of years when it comes to how information is presented regarding black men, right? So it's one of those things. So let's just go ahead and, before we jump in, like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will, so we can keep bringing you this independent black male thought. So make sure you do that. You can do so, as you can see on the screen, through Patreon, Cash App, PayPal, and Venmo, or right here through YouTube. So please make sure you support the channel. Also support the Onyx Network, which you can download on Apple or Android in the App Store if you put in the Onyx Network, or you can pull up on Amazon Fire TV or Roku. You can also watch it online. You can go to my website, www.thasanjohnson.com, click on media, and you can hit the Onyx Network, and you can watch live TV straight from the channel. So please make sure you support so we can continue to do this work and bring it forward out of these small spaces here and there and into the forefront of the discussion. So that said, when I decided to look up black male homelessness, particularly in LA, but in general, I find that the same kinds of problems kind of persist in this area as they have in others. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not the data, right, is disaggregated properly. In other words, what you tend to find is that the data is usually either broken up in terms of race and gender, but not race and gender together. In other words, you can look up the racial breakdown of homelessness, or you can look up the gender breakdown, but they don't usually disaggregate the data so you can see specific populations like black males. And even when you use Google, you find other kinds of problems. So this is one particular Google search, right? And what I used was percentage of black male/men homeless in LA 2022. And you just get these lists, right? These lists. And most of them keep saying black people, black people, black people. Now, we've talked about that before on this channel. Y'all know I talk about flat blackness and I talk about flat maleness, right? And we have both of them happening, and they usually happen together, and they are happening together in this context as well, right? Even one of the studies, and I just pulled this one up just to kind of show you. This is from 2urbangirls.com, and the title of the article Its LA County homeless count results show increase from 2020, with black people representing 30% despite being 9% of the population. Now, other studies I found going back to 2020 actually show that LA black folks are 8% of LA, but 34% of the homeless. So they must be using different data sets, because if they're saying the homelessness rate increased and yet they have black people at 30%, but studies in 2020 show that we were at 34% then, there's probably some slippage there in terms of that. But the reason I pulled this article up is, again, what do you see? Black people, right? Black people. They keep using that over and over again. Now, the reason this is important is because, some of this data, a lot of the numbers that they're throwing around don't really show you what black men go through, especially when you factor in how many are coming out of incarceration, particularly through the pandemic, not having a place to go, not being allowed housing, even when they have housing vouchers. That whole kind of thing ends up remaining a relevant factor. There was something else in here that I think I was going to show, and I think I lost it, but it's okay. Yeah, I lost it. Damn, I had it highlighted and I must have erased it. Anyway, but the reason I was bringing this article up was just to show you that you have this use of black people. So whether we're talking about Google and the constant use of black people or specific articles, you notice the same thing. Now, right, when I was actually using this, when I go through this in my class, this is one of the slides I show. And this is based on data that I've been pulling together since the 1990s, right? And so when you look at black male homelessness, right, it says men constitute 90% of the homeless in the U.S., according to Warren Farrell in his book 2014, dated then. And according to a 1999 study by the Urban Institute, 40% of them are black men, and that was before the Great Recession, and of course before the pandemic. In New York City, 92.9% were black and 82.3% were male, while in Philadelphia, 92.9% were black and 71.1% were male. Some of these men were sexually abused and had no shelters to go to, while others used prison as a shelter. Right? Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration 2011. You'll find that a lot of these little studies and these little information sheets that are posted out at different points in time disappear, and they're hard to find, which is why I started collecting them and putting them into PowerPoints. So just to kind of let you know how dire it has been, right? You saw the numbers, right? 92.9% of the homeless in certain cities at different time periods would be black, and the majority, over 70 and 80%, would be male, right? I think something similar is happening in LA, but we don't always get to see that. So let's look at what we do have in LA. This is the article that I was sent. Very interesting article, right? And I suggest that you save these kind of things, especially in like Evernote or whatever, because these these articles tend to disappear. The data tends to disappear. You'll be talking about it 2 months from now and you can't find it. The URLs don't lead to it anymore. So make an effort if you can to save it. You can do that through Evernote. You can download them, whatever you need to do. Make sure you do something, because a lot of this stuff tends to disappear, right? But this particular article, called A Sea of Black Men's Faces, LA's Black Homelessness Crisis by Ethan Ward, came out February 22nd of this year. I had not seen it prior. So, thank you to those who sent it to me. There's more than one. But it begins to point out some of the issues I'm talking about, right? And you'll notice all throughout the article, especially in the first 2/3 of it, right? Black unhoused people, right? Again, we're back to people, right? The constant use of that. So it begins to cite from Melina Abdullah, black people are 8% of LA's population, but represent 34% of people experiencing homelessness, right? According to a 2020 count by the LA Homeless Services Authority, right? The number of unhoused people could rise when LAHSA conducts the 2022 count this month, right? So I'm going to have to actually find that particular study as well. Remember that. Let me just go ahead and save that. We'll have to look that up. Actually, while I have y'all, let's actually see if we can find it. Come on. What the hell? Oh. I see. All right, let's try. See if it'll let me. Sorry for the excursion. I just want to check something out real quick. There we go. See if we can come up. Beautiful. Okay. Announced results. Shows 81% people experience decline from. Okay, so they're saying there's a further 4% increase from 2020 in the homeless. Right. And let me see. They don't have anything for black men. They don't have anything for black people. All right, so we at least know that there's a rate increase or number increase. And so again, throughout this article, they keep talking about about black people. So when we talk about flat blackness, what I mean by that is that often you'll see numbers on different issues where black males actually experience the bulk of something, and it's still labeled black people, right? To shift some of the attention toward other demographics, whether it's women, LGBT, whatever it is. Even though black males may carry the bulk of something, it's reduced to people so that those numbers can alarm people into action that, in a manner that benefits everybody. But we don't really get to the granular issues that affect black males directly. However, if it is a problem that specifically hits LGBT or women most particularly, then it's cited as such. So we're made hyper alert of when certain demographics experience things, but when it comes to black males, those numbers are flattened to benefit everybody. Because again, when you start talking about these kind of numbers, what you're really talking about is funding. These kind of articles, these kind of studies are all about funding. And if you can get funding, but nobody wants to fund something specifically for black males. So what they do instead is they actually defer those numbers to other demographics so others can benefit, but not when it comes to black men themselves. So that's flat blackness. Now, flat maleness is a little different, right? Usually this is something you tend to see feminists do when they want to make accusations toward black men. What they'll do is sometimes they'll slyly include numbers and data around men in general and deflect it toward black men, even though the numbers don't say that. So even when you hear arguments about black patriarchy, when you listen closely enough, if it's not anecdotal stories about abuse, it tends to be statistics and historical occurrences that are more attributable to white men, but it's deflected toward black men because we're all men, right? So again, this is the usefulness of Jim Sedanius's work, where you're able to kind of critically break apart this generic category of talking about men and actually look at specific groups of men, because specific groups of men have very different experiences. So by class, by race, all the subtleties that they invoke with intersectionality, but they refuse to invoke when it comes to men. And this is how you end up with flat maleness. So when you want to see black men arbitrarily accused of being abusive or patriarchal or so on and so forth, usually you'll see flat maleness being used and invoked against you as a black male to suggest that you're some type of monster because of what all men do, without actually looking at the particularities of what black men do. And then sometimes when they do claim to look at the particularities of black male life, it's usually within the framework of flattening maleness, so they can pull whatever's relevant to their argument, even if it comes from another group, and weaponize it against black males. So again, flat blackness, flat maleness, tools used to either defer attention away from black males or castigate black males using data that doesn't even pertain to them, right? But in this article, again, the majority of the article talks about black people, but the title is very specific, and you'll see why. In terms of this section of the article, bureaucracy and classism, it reads, Veronica Lewis is the director of the Homeless Outreach Program Integrated Care System, HOPICS. She has served on countless commissions to share what she has learned about the reasons black people are overrepresented in the unhoused population. Again, black people, right? For her, this group continues to fall out of permanent housing at alarming rates compared to other populations. Now listen to what she says. People haven't cared about black men living in squalor until we saw them in their communities living in squalor, Lewis said. Every time I go downtown, the sea of black men's faces is so heartbreaking. Right? The resources Lewis is primarily referring to is money, which she says should be targeted to combat Black homelessness, but she says Proposition 209 makes that difficult. Again, notice her quote was in reference to Black males. Before and after her quote is all about Black people, right? When they start talking about resources, they go right back into combating Black homelessness. So we will talk about, and see, there you have it again. Every time I go downtown, the sea of Black men's faces is so heartbreaking. The reason I brought this up is because they made that the title of the article. This was one of the rare few articles that actually identified Black men as having the problem to an unreasonable degree. But most other articles and even Google searches will lead you to nothing more than generic categories of Blackness, right? So even though the majority of this article does that very thing, they had a rare moment of clarity. And the reason they had this moment of clarity, even though I tip the hat to them to actually making it the title of the article, was because when they actually interviewed the person who is the director of homeless outreach, the homeless outreach program integrated care system, she got real. And she talked about what she saw, not just something generic. Now, the article itself flips back into the generic, but at least it gives us a context. At least it lets us know that Black males are experiencing something beyond the pale, right? That's not usually kind of identified. And then later in the article, they deal with incarceration and homelessness. Again, you don't see mention of Black males directly, but if you're going to talk about incarceration and Blackness, Black men are out incarcerate any other group, in the Black community. There's no question about that. But notice how they won't actually use the term Black male, right? They talk about Black Los Angeles, Black Californians, right? They name particular politicians and they start talking about, dealing with homelessness in regard to incarceration, but they don't want to name Black males or Black men after that. So it's my contention that there's a very concerted effort to make sure that Black men are not regarded. So what can we do about that? Well, let's look to a couple of the studies, because the best you can do is just kind of assess based on what we see in other studies. So this particular study, this is the 2020 Greater Los Angeles Homeless Count, Los Angeles Continuum of Care. This was actually the one I just looked up a little while ago because they updated it. I don't think let's see if they have the full study, see if it's accessible here. I don't think so. Oh, they do. Beautiful. All right. So this helps. This definitely helps. Oh yeah. All right. So what we're going to do, going to break from what I planned, and we will compare 2020 and a couple of critical areas from 2022. Just a couple. So again, this particular study here, this count that they did of the homeless in LA was done on one night in January 2020. So it's pre-pandemic, right? Hardest part has been getting, the data disaggregated by race and gender post-pandemic, but we're going to see what we can figure out. So based on this, again, January 2020, pre-pandemic homelessness in Los Angeles. Let's look at some of the major markers, right? So we're going to jump all the way down to gender. And if you look at gender, what it tells you is that 67%, right? 67% of the homeless are male, right? We know that 32% are female, 1% transgender, gender non-binary, including transgender, 0%. Now, the 1% may be more significant than not because the transgender population is extremely small, but, so in essence, for the small number of them that are homeless, that might be high considering the rate, but the number of transgender, folk in LA are particularly small, right? But we know 67% are male. It does say includes transgender for male or female, but transgender as a separate category don't have many. Yeah, so I would let that 1% kind of tell you something about the percentage of that are influencing or included in the number of males and females. But we'll kind of bracket that. So let's go to race, right? And we notice that 34% of the homeless are Black, 36% are Latino. So Black folk make up about 8% of LA though, right? And they are about 34%. So that's pretty significant, to observe. We know that's a pretty significant difference in population size. But 34% of the homeless for the Black community, 8% of the total population. Then we pop down to sexual orientation. 91% of the homeless are straight, 3% are gay, 2% are bi, and 4% are sexual orientation non-conforming. Another interesting marker, when you talk about health and disability, right? 27% suffering from substance abuse disorder, 25% from serious mental illness. And one of the last categories you might take note of is those who experience domestic violence. 33%, 7% are homeless due to fleeing from domestic violence. But the major takeaway I wanted you to get from this, since we talk about Black men over here on the Onyx Report, is that the overwhelming majority, even though Blacks are 8% of the population, 34% are homeless, as far as Black folk. 67% are homeless as far as men. So this suggests to us that straight Black men are the overwhelming majority. Now that's 2020 before the pandemic. Let's look at 2022. And I haven't looked at this yet. So, you guys are seeing it. If you haven't read it already, you're seeing it when I'm seeing it. So let's hop down just like we did before. Let's look at gender. Males, 75%. So the rate of homelessness for men went up since the pandemic. The rate of homelessness for women went down. You guys remember all those reports during the pandemic about the she session, women losing their jobs, women being the most evicted, and all of that is, true. Those things occurred. But one of the things I kept telling y'all is they're not including Black men, because Black men had high rates of homelessness and joblessness before the pandemic. So even though they're charting the difference in women's experiences, they're ignoring the fact that men were already at extreme numbers prior to the pandemic. So when you get the pandemic in place, what you actually find is that they don't pay you any attention, because they've always only focused on the difference from women before and during the pandemic. Men's numbers were already extreme. They got worse, but nobody cared. Nobody talked about it. But we're seeing it here, just in terms of gender. It went up from 67% in 2020 before the pandemic to 75%, right? Again, 1% transgender, questioning and non-binary, 0%. All right. So when we go down to race, right? Black community apparently drops to 30%. So even though the articles are saying that homelessness went up 4% in LA, they're saying the population of Black folk in particular who are homeless seems to have gone down, whereas the white population went up to 39%. So we know in 2020, white population was at 25%, right? Now we're seeing in 2022, the white population went to 39%. Black population dropped 4%, even though, again, they keep saying all these numbers went up. So interesting. But again, remember, African Americans, about 8% of LA. So 30% is still high based on the population. All things being equal, at best, it should be representative of the sample size. If the population is 8%, homelessness shouldn't be more than 8%. So those are things to consider as well. As far as the age is concerned, we know the majority of the homeless are between 30 and 39. I didn't cover that in 2020. So let's look at that very quickly. Majority of the population, 20 to 54 is a much larger gap. So that's what they did on that one for 2020. But they got a little more specific in 2022. And we know that the largest population as far as age is 30 to 39. Right? So again, we're talking about Black men, or we're talking about men who are Black and who are ages 30 to 39. Right? That seems to be the dominant population. And in terms of sexuality, sexual orientation, 90% straight. Right? 90% straight. 4% questioning, 3% bisexual, 3% gay or lesbian, 90% straight. So again, and then, if we look at substance abuse, we see substance abuse disorder at 30%, serious mental illness at 32%. Right? And again, remember the population size is 8%. 44% have experienced domestic violence. 11% are fleeing due to that. So let's read this in a different way, right? So starting from the top, right? As far as the what we're going to do is we're going to kind of picture the primary homeless person in Los Angeles, 2022, according to the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, right? So what it's telling us is that these are individuals. They're not in family units. That's 85% household composition. So these are individuals who are homeless, right? They are 13% of them are veterans. So, small percentage, right? 48% experience chronic homelessness. So these are black men that are chronically homeless, right? So again, we're looking at individuals, some of whom are veterans, half of whom are chronically homeless. They're 75% male. They're 30% black. 30% of the total population of of homeless folk are, black. They are 30 to 39 years old. They are 90% straight. 30% of whom have substance use disorder. 32% suffer from serious mental illness. 44 have experienced domestic violence. But we don't talk about black men experiencing domestic violence. We only talk about black men as, giving it, right? Extending it. They're the aggressors. But this is telling you that the composite image of the homeless person in Los Angeles, as far as the black population are concerned, domestic violence survivors with substance abuse and mental illness disorders who are 30 to 39 years old, black, 75% male. Half of whom are chronically homeless, some of whom are veterans, and mostly 85% individuals. That's what the sea of faces referred to when they gave this quote from Veronica Lewis, director of the Homeless Outreach Program Integrated Care System. That's the sea of faces. They're not just black people, they're black men. But we can't say black men because our ideology, our gender ideology, doesn't allow for empathy toward men because men are patriarchal aggressors and therefore aren't worthy of empathy. Even though we're not going to really break down as to whether or not that actually applies to black men, we're just going to assume it because that's what we've been taught about, most particularly straight men, let alone straight black men. But she's actually telling you on the ground, despite the language of this article, what's really happening. But let's look at another study, and this is the last one I'll pull up. This is the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. This is dated 2021. The Making of a Crisis, a History of Homelessness in Los Angeles. And this is important. I'm going to just take you straight to page 22 because it's going to drop something on you that I think is incredibly interesting. So starting right about here, it says, by the 1950s, data from the LA County Department of Charities confirmed that African Americans in the 1950s were vastly overrepresented among its general relief applicants. While black men comprised 5.2% of the county's adult male population, they made up 17.45% of sampled applicants. Of those surveyed, nearly 60% lacked shelter upon contacting the department. This is going back to the 1950s, right? Let's go back to the 1950s. So what am I saying? It's 2022. Black males are the majority of the homeless. They're the majority in terms of being individuals, roughly 30 to 39. And many of them have been incarcerated, have nowhere to go. Nobody will rent to them, even if they have housing vouchers. This is the reality of black male life. This is what a lot of people don't want to talk about because it doesn't suit their agenda, one way or another, as to what we're supposed to think, what we're supposed to feel, and what we're supposed to know about black men. We're supposed to make assumptions based on our feelings, based on what we want to be true, and none of it matters in terms of what's accurately so. So if we go back to the 50s to now, we find that black men have been the majority of the homeless in the LA area for the longest. And even though we tap dance around this language of black people, it's not what this is. It is about black men. And if we don't have the capacity to speak truth enough to even say it, then how many policies are actually going to be put in place to help them? Y'all tell me. And that's LA. What about Philly? What about New York? What about Chicago? What about Atlanta? What about all these other places? Texas? What about the Bay Area in California? What about these areas where we have larger numbers of black folk? Black men experiencing homelessness to the greatest degree. And this leads me back to the beginning of this particular video. We have Richard Reeves, who I have some issues with, but I'll get to in another video soon, who's talking about the crisis going on with men right now. And he's talking about it as a leftist. He's trying to categorize it, make sense of it, because among the left, again, we're not supposed to talk about men. So he's at least being willing to put men out there. And one of the things he points out is that there's a gender gap. there's a black gender gap when it comes to these experiences. Now, he's late to the party because those of us in black male studies and even in the manosphere have been talking about this for over 5 years, right? We called it anti-black misandry in black male studies. We talk about it in the manosphere. Well, we've been cataloging this for years. Even before I started my own channel and I was coming to BGS, and BGS and I were having these public discussions, BGS doing that work. Now we got Green Gorilla, Dr. Ron Neal, and plenty of other brothers that have been pointing these things out for years. There has been a black gender gap, and it doesn't go the contemporary way we've been known to define it, in terms of gender gap, suggesting it as intersectionality does, that women are the primary victims. No, we're actually talking about looking at some of the most important metrics that impact the black community, and finding that men have been at the bottom or the top, depending on how the metric is framed, on the worst issues across the board. Not in all issues, but in overall, yeah, the majority of the worst. From health to homelessness to employment, you name it. You name it. This is what we're dealing with. So at some point, we got to take what we know and begin to actually talk about what's needed. And the reason I keep pushing this is because you got white scholars like Richard Reeves that are slowly coming to this conclusion. And I don't know how many people are bothering to listen to him, but at least they're listening. So we come back to the black male political agenda, and you'll find that as you go through them, targeted homeless programs are there for a reason, because we've known this data. This isn't new for us. So if you're interested in that, right, it's a very small section. It talks about, especially post-incarceration, black men should be prioritized for housing, as they are the most often turned away despite having vouchers. Consequently, as black America constituted half of America's homeless pre-COVID and remains disproportionately homeless, the majority of the homeless across race tends to be male. This makes black males the most susceptible group to homelessness. If you have a specific idea on how we can begin to propose ideas to repair this, please submit them to the Black Male Political Agenda. But at the end of the day, this is the work we got to do. And we got to start the conversation because nobody else is going to. Appreciate your time. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.